And so I'd like to introduce our speakers at this time. Our first speaker is Paola Zeni. Paola is the Senior Director of Global Privacy at Palo Alto Networks, which is a next-generation security company. Her mission is to ensure the privacy is incorporated in the security fabric of her company by working cross-functionally with all teams. Paola is a veteran of the information security industry, having worked for years at Symantec, where she led the Privacy Program Office. She has been working on privacy issues for more than 15 years. First in Europe for HP and Agilent Technologies, and later in the US as Global Privacy Lead for Agilent. She has a law degree from the Catholic University of Milan and an LLM in US law from the University of Santa Clara. She is a member of the IAPP, has practiced law in Italy, and is a member of the California Bar. And then at the end, we have Dave Maher. David is the CTO at Intertrust. He was head of the Secure Systems Research Department and chief architect for AT&T's secure communications products used by the US Department of Defense and the White House for top secret communications. He has designed numerous systems for electronic commerce as well. He was also the chief scientist for AT&T Universal Card and a member of AT&T's Privacy Review Board. He has more recently specialized in privacy-preserving systems relating to big data. He holds dozens of patents and has published papers in the fields of mathematics, electrical engineering, and computer science. And then we also have our last speaker in the middle, Dr. Thomas Sanders. And Dr. Thomas Sanders is a senior research scientist and director of data privacy at Intertrust Technologies. Prior to joining Intertrust, Thomas worked for 14 years at Hewlett-Packard Labs, where he was a member of the Security and Manageability Lab, which conducts research in security, privacy, and cloud technologies. During his tenure at HP, he created the HP Privacy Advisor, which is a decision support tool that HP employees use for better handling of personal information. Thomas was also the lead scientist for creating HP's Threat Central solution, which is a platform for threat information sharing used by more than 150 organizations. In 2014, he founded what's known as the ACM Workshop on Information Sharing and Collaborative Security. ACM stands for the Association of Computing Machinery, so it's a very well-known technical advisory group. And then earlier in his career, he worked on a broad range of topics relating to advanced digital rights management. Thomas received a doctorate in mathematics from the University of Dortmund, Germany, and he then completed a postdoctoral work as a researcher at the International Computer Science Institute in Berkeley, California. He's currently in New York, and his research interests include computer security, privacy, and cryptography. My background, I've worked in information security and privacy for the past 6 years, most recently working with data breaches in computer and other computer investigations. By training, I'm a data analytics person. And I'm here to moderate today. So I'd like to introduce Paola right now, formally, and if you'd like to get started, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks everybody for being here. Good to see so many people. Well, you know, I see quite a few familiar faces. So for people that have been in privacy for a while, privacy by design has become a little bit of a household term ever since Anne Cavoukian, who then was the commissioner of Ontario in Canada, published the 7 principles of privacy by design. And the goal of those principles was to help with implementation of the fair information practices. And the idea behind the principles is to have a privacy that is proactive, so not a privacy that reacts to risks or dangers like often even security does, but really something that prevents those risks from ever happening. Privacy that is embedded in whatever an organization is doing, both in terms of building products or business processes or business operations, and also a privacy that is by default, that does not require a trade-off by the user, that is kind of automatic, and with the goal of respecting and protecting the individual. And I encourage everybody, even though it's been a few years, to look at some of the writings that came out of Anke Boekje's office, because when you fast forward to the GDPR, you can see that not only in Article 25, which is the privacy by design and by default article, but also in the concept of consent, having to be specific, there is a lot of those ideas and those principles, and even some of the buzzwords have trickled down. So the regulator went all the way to adopt the data protection by design by default as the title of the section of Article 25. So it was not a law before, it is a law now. And it's fairly dense, it's two sections. One is about privacy by design, the second one more by default. But the key requirement for organizations is to adopt measures that are organizational and technical, and so it's going to be a lot of information about technical measures as well, to really to implement the data protection principles in a way that's effective. So the words that are being used, implementing and effective, all hint at the fact that your privacy needs to happen. Privacy by design is something that needs to happen. And then there is also an important piece that says that the necessary safeguards for data have to be integrated into the processing. So there's numerous words that hint at the idea that organizations will have to unpack what they do in order to embed and integrate the privacy into what it is that they're doing. And what is interesting is that if you read the whole section, it says that those measures have to be implemented both at the time when an organization is determining the means of processing. So an organization is thinking about the way in which it will process information. That's a time in which they're supposed to think about those private data protection principles, and also, of course, when they are in the course of processing information. So the fact that the provision mentions 2 times means you have to do it while you're doing it, but you have to have it planned before, because when you're determining, when you're thinking, and that's where your engineers are designing the products or establishing a certain business process, you have to think about it at that time. So that's very crucial in the definition of privacy by design. Privacy by default takes it even one notch higher. The idea is you have to implement, and you have to implement the necessary a safeguard, but also only collect the data that is necessary for a specific purpose. And the word is specific. And again, remember, consent has to be specific. The purpose has to be specific. So a lot of potentially threatening concepts for big data and machine learning as we know it, because when you're requiring specificities of companies and you're asking them to stick to what's necessary for that specific purpose, of course, you are potentially casting some concerns around gathering data for future use or for different purposes. And the idea is that data has to be minimized, and pseudonymization is one way to accomplish data minimization. Another concept is that the data that is necessary for a specific purpose has to be the right amount of data. It has to be kept long enough, but no more. And it also has to be accessible just by the people that really need that. So the concept of necessity is applied through and through to the whole information lifecycle. So how do we do that? This is the basic theory. Well, when you're translate this into an organization and you have to be able to explain this to engineers or working with product managers, and especially relatively small organizations, you need, in my experience, you need a mix of tools, because tools give a certain repeatability and predictability to the process, and that's comforting for people that are not lawyers, they're not in the privacy field, they never want to be, and you're just one more problem for them. And then there's processes, of course, because processes are what it means to be embedded, to be integrated, to be into the processing. And then, of course, technology. We'll hear quite a bit about that. So, and with regard to tools, I'm going to just share my experience. There is a certain portion of privacy by design that is by definition interactive. You can have a checklist, you can have a questionnaire, but I haven't been able to roll out in a relatively small size company something that would automate that process and take out the human interaction. You still need to have relationships with people, and you still need to talk to them about what they're doing. And the only thing you can do, you can make it repeatable by telling them, these are the questions that I will ask you every time you come with a new product. This is what I will want to know. And these are the key juncture decisions that we will take together, or I will want to be able to provide my inputs into those decisions. So again, a checklist or a questionnaire, whatever works best in an organization, it's usually fairly effective to that purpose. Another tool, of course, is some standard templates. So as you're asking people to put together data flows or data mapping, it's important to agree on a nomenclature, agree on a format, agree on a tool, and just try to stick with that. It may not be perfect, other companies may have more shiny objects, but it's really, again, important to make it repeatable and predictable for the people that work with you so they can get familiar with it. And which leads me to another important tool, which is education. Don't underestimate the value of educating your engineers on what it means, what privacy is, at least some of the basics. Nobody wants to be turned into an expert, of course, but really making a significant investment in making sure that they understand what they're supposed to do and what they're supposed to think about. And then, eventually I always have the hope that it will get to be to a level of maturity where you can think about automating all this, but I definitely am not there yet. And just to share some learning experiences is what I've tried in the past. I've tried to be very granular with requirements, so flesh out a lot of scenarios, and then sooner than you know, you'll have like a 30, 40-page document, and that it's total turn off for people. So which is why I prefer to have something that looks more like a questionnaire or a checklist where key decision points are raised. The second and last point I wanted to make is about process. So if you don't know how things are done, you're not going to be able to embed yourself into that. So there needs to be a certain investment of time in understanding how people do things. Challenges for smaller and medium companies, processes don't exist or are not very well documented or are not very robust. So that is definitely a challenge. And that's where the establishing relationships with people is really very important and very valuable. And one of my biggest partners, especially in working with people that design product, is product marketing. So they're very attuned with what people are cooking, and so if they're partnering with you, they'll pull you in at a time in which you can still have an impact on the product design. And the last leg of the stool is technology, which leads me to the next. Tomas, you're going to use this?
Yes, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming here. It's a great pleasure to be here from New York. It's even hotter here almost than in New York at this moment, but it's fine. So in the technology community, we've been talking about designing technologies that support privacy for probably more than 20 years. There have been technologies for anonymous credentials, anonymous payment systems, anonymous web browsing, and many other applications, also secure multi-party computation protocols, cryptographic protocols that were advanced. So, however, there is a difference to privacy by design, and that is that privacy by design, as Paola already pointed out, looks at technology much more holistically. So it looks from the point when the data are collected to the point of data deletion that privacy properties are protected throughout all the touch points of the data. And it also needs to address a broad range of privacy requirements, not just hiding information or so, which often the academic work has done or the other technical work. But what to do? What is privacy by design? And what Paola already said, so there's data minimization and pseudonymization explicitly mentioned in the GDPR, but otherwise it's vague. So the truth is there have been different approaches suggested, but as of today, there is no standard approach, so you have to a little bit to roll your own when you go about it. However, there's something interesting out there, the German standard data protection model, which actually tried to look at the legal requirements in the GDPR, is linking them to data protection goals and then to technical measures to implement them. And that is much broader than just data minimization and pseudonymization. So for example, there are also goals such as availability, integrity, confidentiality, transparency, unlinkability, and intervenability, by which I think is meant that a user can, for example, give his consent, can withdraw his consent, can access his data, and all these different things. All these different functionalities should be supported by your technology. So from my perspective, that makes privacy by design fairly complex. And I think you mentioned people don't want to be an expert. Actually, my experience is a little different. There are always some technologists somewhere who love becoming an expert, and they should, because you need it in order to address all these different matters. So, and it requires also a real effort from the engineering team to implement all these things. So there's also sometimes resistance, and if you have a champion in the engineering team who's trying to push this through, that's going to be really helpful to get things done. So a good starting point, and Paola mentioned this, I think something practical is to map out the data flows, to look out the application stakeholders that are going to touch the data, purpose for which is being used, then identify the privacy risks, and then come up with a strategy to address them, and that would presumably include some technologies. So in order to have these technologies, what a privacy engineer needs to know is he needs to have sort of a toolbox of things he can do. And there's a certain toolbox of things that are relatively basic and simple that I think everybody in this field who tries to do that should understand. So for example, for data minimization, you want to remove data fields. For precise location data, you want to make them imprecise. You have all these different ways to sort of minimize the type of data that you're collecting. And you want to apply this minimization, data minimization, not just during the collection phase, but also during the later stages of processing and also when you're sharing data with others. So you only want to share the minimal that you want to do. So other technique is pseudonymization. Certain things that you can do is, for example, that the advertising industry does is they're just hashing PII. You take an email, you hash it. You don't share the email, but you share the hash of the email, because there you still have linkability. So you don't get unlinkability, but you still have linkability. Different partners in the advertising ecosystem can share user profiles together via the hashed email, for example, without actually having to share the PII itself. If you like that or not, that's a different question, but that's currently quite accepted practice in the industry. But there are other techniques that one should know. There's format-preserving encryption, which allows you, for example, something that looks like a credit card number to replace it with a pseudonym that also looks like a credit card number, to encrypt it in that way. And there are different ways to pseudonymize data. So those are some of the simple things that I think a privacy engineer should understand. Other techniques such as access control, of course, applying it very stringently throughout, again, the stages of the processing of the data is a standard thing. And then there are techniques around data aggregation. So for example, one classic technique is k-anonymity. So if you release data brokers, for example, do that. If you release data, you implement a form of disclosure control where, for example, good data brokers do that. Where, for example, you might say that someone loves golf and has a dog and lives in a certain zip code in California, that you only would release that information if there are at least K people in your database who fill that profile. So their K would be 20. So that you can pinpoint from that information who that individual is. So that's, again, a relatively simple technique. But the research community has come up with new techniques. For example, differential privacy is something you might have heard of that is still sort of slowly transitioning from research into application. So Google and Apple have been doing stuff with that, which is wonderful. And that's perhaps something that's not so necessary to know about, but it can also be incredibly helpful probably a few years in the future. Another goal that you want to support, something that's in the GDPR everywhere, is accountability. So to support accountability, you can do that on the level of documentation. So this is also what Paola mentioned. So you can do that on the level of documentation, but you also can do that on the level of, for example, logging access to data and modification of personal data, and then later, being able to report on this information. So you can look at, so you have some evidence that, for example, only really the people who are supposed to access the data actually accessed it. Some resources for you if you want to learn more. There are a number of more techniques. So I recommend, as a lawyer, you might find it interesting to look at the German Standard Data Protection Model. The ENISA, the European Union Agency for Network and Information Security, had several reports on privacy by design. And OASIS has a technical committee on privacy by design, and there are several specifications available, including on how to do documentation, and there's an FTC report. So that should get you started. Thank you.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here with everybody today, and it's great to hear a number of different perspectives here on data privacy. And the perspective that I have is more towards, it's sort of counter to some of the goals and strategies described by GDPR, but because of the fact that we have to go beyond GDPR in what I'm about to talk about, we actually have to have even more robust security by design and privacy by design strategies. So the example is what I'm talking about is that we are focusing, a lot of us are focusing on making data more and more useful. And if you think about it, GDPR is saying, describe how you're going to use the data and only use it that way. It's kind of static in that sense. Yet the history of the use of data shows how there are many serendipitous applications. A good example of that was a few decades ago, there was a fairly large blackout in the Northeast. It actually started in the Midwest and spread all the way up the East Coast. And no one understood at all how that happened, why it spread so widely. And people were hoping to be able to figure it out, and they couldn't. Now it turns out that there was a proxy data set for what actually happened. That data set happened to be in the phone record databases. And the reason that was a good proxy data set is, you know, when the power goes out, you call your neighbor, you call the phone, the police, you call anybody. Is your power out? That's happened to me recently, and that's exactly what I did. I wanted to understand, is it coming back on? All of those kinds of things. Well, it turned out that AT&T had a fairly extensive phone record database, highly private, extremely well protected. But data scientists could take that database, actually I'm not saying it correctly, but I'll correct myself in a second, take that database and apply visualization tools. So you can actually see, here's where the blackout started, here's the next substation, here's the next substation after that, et cetera. You could see sort of an explosion of the graph of the way in which the different, I'm probably getting carried away with my hands here, but you could see the way in which the blackout proceeded. And so the phone record database was a proxy set for the actual progress of the outage. And that provided a lot of useful data. Now, no one envisioned you would use that database for that purpose. And in fact, it was not particularly easy to at first get access to it. And in fact, the people at Bell Labs didn't really have direct access to it. And it actually shows the effectiveness of a certain principle. And that is, the data was well protected, but the data scientists could at least say, this is how we want to process that data. They could put together some computer programs and visualization programs and hand it over to the custodians of the data and have it run on their computers. It turned out that that was technically possible to do with a little bit of fudging around. But the point here is that the data didn't have to be handed to the researchers. And in general, a strategy of keep the data in place, but bring the computation to the data is in fact a way in which a strategy for allowing data to be highly useful if you can vet the computation and the people who are going to, in effect, use the data and vet the output, then you can pretty safely make serendipitous use of data. Now, I think that we're going to want to be able to apply that principle. In fact, we are seeing that principle be applied more and more nowadays, because another big motivation for the use of highly personal data goes far beyond phone records is medical data. The trend in the medical field is to be able to practice something called precision medicine, sometimes called personalized medicine. Hopefully all medicine in the clinic is personalized, but what is really meant that it's so precise that it applies to you, and somebody isn't just giving you some medicine or a treatment that operates on a broad class but doesn't specifically operate on you. So the way precision medicine is starting to move is, first of all, people are gathering large data sets. That's turning out to be terrifically difficult, mostly by various HIPAA laws, but also just the way in which research in the medical field has been done and continues to be done. You have research protocols, and you have research programs that take 5 to 10 years to complete. But if you think about all of the data, medical data that is out there that could be made useful to try to understand, for example, a specific form of cancer or something like that, there's a tremendous amount of data out there, but no one can accumulate it in a place that it can be analyzed. But the whole goal of precision medicine would be you walk into a doctor's office, and the doctor determines your symptoms, looks at your personal medical record. That personal medical record has genetic information, epigenetic information, environmental information, your history of where you lived and things of that sort. And in precision medicine, that's going to be bounced against a huge database of lookalike models. Those lookalike models are going to be a model for what it is, for all of the symptoms that you have. There may be a few people who have that symptoms. There's also associated treatments. Those treatments then are going to be treatments that are known to apply to your lookalike class. And the better and the smaller you can make that lookalike class, the better. That also sort of defeats some of the purposes of the GDPR, on the other hand. So there's an interesting perspective here that I want to explore with you a little bit later on. But I'm always looking for people to help me try to figure out how to deal with those contradictions.
I have a few questions that I had wanted to ask briefly, and then we were going to open up questions to the audience. One of the first questions I had actually goes back to is attributed to Dr. Ann Cavoukian, and so this is for everyone. But the question, so I'll just want to read a statement if you could bear with me for a second. She has stated that protecting privacy while meeting regulatory requirements for data protection around the world is becoming an increasingly challenging task. Taking a comprehensive, properly implemented risk-based approach where globally defined risks are anticipated and countermeasures are built into systems and operations by design can be far more effective and more likely to respond to the broad range of requirements in multiple jurisdictions. When I read that, the question that comes to mind is, how do we incorporate a perspective of design rather than just thinking of risk and countermeasures? Because the design is different than risk and countermeasures, which I often think about in a classic security context. So how do we focus on the design? I guess more so than like working with your product team, what are some other things that we could be doing than just checklists? One thing I've heard is that some companies in their product roadmap have been working to realign their product roadmaps, for instance, so that privacy plays a more active role as a stakeholder, for instance. And so I don't know if you've thought any more or have some maybe comments about how we can just better bring privacy to the product, maybe the product management and design process.
Yeah, so one way to do this is to focus, rather than just on countermeasures and problems, to focus on privacy goals. So previously I had this list of privacy goals that one would want to accomplish. And one of the things as a technical community has been done, they've been creating design patterns that you can use to achieve those goals. So then you can, rather than focusing from the problems, you can start a little bit from the solution, and you can think about the design patterns, how you can achieve certain things in your software. You can just incorporate them into your product.
What's an example of a design pattern? If you could give us one, please.
Well, for example, let's say that you could use encryption. I mean, this is a more advanced design pattern, but you could, for example, some from secure multi-party computation, if you wanted to compute the intersection of two lists, then there are cryptographic protocols that can help you do that. And for example, Google used a version of this in its advertising world. So that would be like one sort of building blocks that you could use in order to do that from the field of secure multi-party computation, so that it protects the inputs.
That's good. So then we're starting to go more granular now. We're not just protecting the data, we're protecting the processing with the data, as well as you mentioned, working with the algorithms to make them more secure. So another question, this is for Paula, is how do you believe that one could discuss PBD requirements with the board and executive teams? So how do you socialize this concept in the organization? You know, it's part of that educational process.
Yes, it is part of the educational process. I guess it depends from the business you're in. For certain businesses, it is easier to make an argument that design is going to reduce friction in closing deals, in the adoption of your technology, for instance. So if you're thinking about enterprise security, which is a space I've been in for quite a while, you want to anticipate the concern that customers may have about having to make trade-offs between security and privacy, right? So you want them to just adopt the technology and feel that they're good. They're good on privacy as well. So that's where the concept of design and anticipating and being proactive and being thinking about the goal in due time is something that may be helpful. There are other organizations, depending from the business where they are, where compliance may still be the biggest selling point. So especially if they're regulated sector. So I don't know that there is a one size fits all. So certain boards are going to be more sensitive to just the fines and the fact that there could be a penalty, and it is going to be huge with GDPR. Others are going to be more sensitive to a business opportunity argument, or again, reducing the friction for the adoption of your products and your technology. I hope this answers the question.
I think that's great. Thank you so much. And for Tomas and David, so in working with developers, I've often heard we're developers, we don't do security. Our other team does that, or we substitute it out, but we do something else, or maybe that's something that is embedded in the libraries. I'm not sure with what you have heard with respect to that, but how do you implement privacy by design and at the same time help companies focus on reducing friction so it doesn't seem like another checkbox, another piece of work, but it actually helps to improve the business or improve the relationship with your clients?
A few approaches. One is most people would be familiar with a system design lifecycle, and then long before you get into development, you will have a data architecture. You'll have system architecture, put together before the development, and security, or rather, in this case, privacy by design, is going to encourage you to have a data architecture where all the data records have, I would say, a lot of labels on them that can be used to determine, not just to say that a specific data record itself is confidential, or that it's PII, or whatever it might be, because as it turns out, the assembly of a lot of information turns out to be the most interesting from the point of view of data protection. But having data modeling that includes explicit data labeling and a data management system that allows for and in fact explicitly describes how policy can be applied in an automatic way in practically any data management system. That will allow at least people to be able to post hoc apply policy for privacy preservation. And it will allow people to figure out ways in which you can share data. The other principle, by the way, that again, the sort of the distributed data architecture is not to distribute the data in too many places. And by that, I don't mean don't do database sharding. But what I really mean is that design your systems in a way in which you can take advantage of the principle I described before, bringing the computation to the data so that I don't have to hand it out to somebody whose data policies I don't know is going to, that they have to have the data in order to apply the computation. Design your system in such a way that you want a result. Well, give me your computation and I'll hand you back the result.
Thanks. There's another question that I have, and it's the idea of maybe privacy officers becoming technology champions, maybe adding a little bit to the role. One thing I think of is there are companies out there, so there's I don't know if everybody's familiar with DevOps, development operations, but in the Bay Area we have many companies changing the way that we build product, where we're reducing the footprint of development, where the QA, all of the work in the middle goes away. And so you develop, you push a button, and everything goes right to production or to manufacturing. It's lean operations. And so in that capacity, or there are companies now like PagerDuty, which collect all of this information, help to prioritize information. And so now security, as an example, is becoming part of just monitoring and managing your systems. So we're integrating everything and becoming more lean. Are there opportunities, do you think, where privacy officers could learn a little bit more about the technologies and become champions in helping businesses just adapt to a lean thought of mind and also adjust and adopt to technologies that are very privacy friendly just from the beginning? So if that makes sense.
So I'm not sure how well I can answer this question, but I would say there are some technologies out. I mean, some of the things about logging and audit logs and so on, they could certainly apply because that's something that the operations teams can do. They can look into it and they can work together. The development teams can build this for the operations team, and maybe there can be a little bit of interaction, close interaction there. But I would also say with the information collection itself that you just described, it can potentially also be a privacy issue, because I know, for example, security people want to collect a lot of data from their IT systems, and they want to collect everything because they don't quite know yet what they need to detect attacks or insider threats or other things. And so one needs, I think whenever one has such an initiative, the privacy by design approach is that one needs to look at this and to make sure that it does things in a good way. And if you go to Europe, you better do that, because, for example, in Germany, as soon as you monitor what employees are doing or something like that, if you collect those sort of event data, you're immediately in trouble if you haven't talked to the work councils before. And my advice would be talk to the German first. If you get through them, you can take the rest of Europe.
I think I'm a big fan of using virtualization and visualization technologies for tracking all kinds of things, including data. And this is something that I think that privacy officers and people who are in the enforcement area ought to be able to not just understand what they are, but also actively use them. If you, for example, have ways in which you can, again, if you've labeled the data properly, you can have watch data flows, and you can characterize what normal behavior is for data flows you could have people look for anomalies. And you can have automated systems look for anomalies, but sometimes a human is actually better at detecting those kinds of things. And so using virtualization and visualization technology should be part of, I think, of a toolkit. You don't have to understand what's underneath, but it should be, can be a good representation of where data is moving and perhaps who has access to it, what kind of queries are there, and things of that sort. That I think is a good part of the toolkit.
So were you thinking that by making some steps of these processes leaner, this would reduce the need for information and for manual tinkering with information?
Well, I think that's it. Where privacy by design means go to the data, and there's so much there, there's not much you can do. It's overwhelming. So at the same time, if like the data flows are actually great, if you can go and work with visualization teams, you're already analyzing all this information. How can you bring looking at specific data attributes or containers of information, so to speak, and add in another layer to your system to audit and monitor, but something that works and focuses directly on the use of data. Which leads me to another question that I would have. In Europe, there was, is it David Soloff or Daniel Soloff, who had mentioned there's direct data that we can directly track about people, then there's different layers of abstraction moving away from a person. So my IP address, for instance, at my home is an abstraction of me. It's related to me until it's changed by my service provider, but it's not me directly. At least I don't think it is. But how do we incorporate rules to help guide the identification of maybe not what's directly me, but what's related to me? Are there any boundaries in machine information that you might think of? That's one of the challenges I think of, is how do we address that risk? There's kind of that gray area where things are somewhat related to me, but not exactly. Like in HIPAA, there's one in their safe harbor, there's the license plate on your car that they have is one of the pieces of listed information, and while that's maybe about me, if it's my friend's car, it's not, I drove the car, but the car has nothing to do with me, and yet that's listed under safe harbor. So how do we build some rules of common sense about tracking information and deal with the gray area? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's a moving target, honestly, because the definition of personal information, especially, regulation reiterates what it's been historically been. It's just so contextual that, I'm not a technology person, so definitely struggling to come up with a good idea that would, technology that would solve this. But this is the big challenge with privacy, which makes it somewhat different from security, because I think it is more contextual, and there is always that scary dimension. I mean, I was listening to the fascinating example of the phone call information, the AT&T data, and but this is scary in a way, to think that you could reverse engineer starting from a given event, which could be any event, and go back and see who was talking about it right before it happened or right after it happened, and who were they talking to. I mean, the potential for surveillance, and then I won't go through the personalized medicine and pre-existing conditions and relationship with insurances, because that could get even more complicated. But that's the scary dimension.
So I would think the GDPR also talks about transparency. So for all and for all this different information that you talk about, one should also track consent, have a little bit of a history where it comes from. That relates to what Dave talked about, also that you have attributes associated with the data, like privacy policies and so on, that sort of travel with the data a little bit to control this. And I think one of the things, the big challenges in Europe is going to be that we need to have a system, some automated system that allows people to share consent, to understand which type of data, at which level of anonymization you can share with which parties, for which purposes. That is exactly needed in order to control that flow, because the reality is lots of parties today can those anonymized data, take them and re-identify them in many different ways, and there are always new ways they're coming up with to do that.
Yeah, the definitions that are in the GDPR are helpful, but they're also going to challenge us. An example is truly anonymous data, by their definition, is not really covered. But truly anonymous data means that if you use the term anonymized data and you anonymize by de-identifying it, it can't be re-identified. It's impossible. So if that's what you mean by anonymous data, then you don't have to worry about it. But whether or not a data set can, or a data record can be re-identified, or proving it can't, proving the negative, is going to be pretty challenging for us. And whether or not you are talking about k-anonymity, you're narrowing, let's say, down to maybe a fairly large value of k. It may turn out to be a much smaller value of k than you thought. And again, proving those kinds of things is going to be difficult. The concept of pseudo-anonymous is covered by GDPR. And there's some interesting guidelines there. There are, however, some different strategies that you could take to make data pseudonymous, but there are risks associated with them. For example, even encrypting data, what do you do with the key? Who has access to the key and things of that sort? That's going to be a challenge. So it's just a big system design problem. If you're claiming your data is pseudonymous, you've got to make sure that your system maintains that property, and it may be very difficult to show that you can do that.
And so I think at this time we had wanted to open questions to the audience, if anybody has any questions. Yes, please. Oh, and then behind you is a wireless microphone. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. So, Dr. Paolo, you mentioned about the privacy by design and the necessity to, when you gather that data, you have to use whatever is, if necessary. So how do you define necessary? Because it can be interpreted differently by different people. And
so what is this data for? And then you would look at your data, whatever record you have, and all the data attributes in those records, and then ask and say, okay, if I take this out, is this record or is this data set still serving the purpose? If it doesn't, then that piece of element is necessary. That's how I would do it practically. I don't know whether there is any different standard for a technologist, but I would adopt a very practical standard. You always have to think about the final objective, which is the purpose.
which means like it's very broad term, and like, you know, as a product or service owner, you want to gather as much data as possible in the goal of understanding the customer. And you can always justify, I do this and that and this, and you can get a way of gathering as much information
Absolutely.
as you want, and it makes this regulations
Right, but
necessary.
right, but if you put the concept of purpose in the context of the whole regulation, purpose is something you're sharing with the data subject. When required, it is actually agreed upon by the data subject, and so the purpose is not just something that can be a purely internal purpose, which is, well, I want to know my customers better. Well, of course, we all do, right? So you have to, if you're acquiring information for the purposes of a specific transaction, for instance, well, that's your purpose. And so I think, yeah, of course, there is some judgment. It is important, and that's where process comes in. It is also important to be able to show to regulators and potentially to customers the thought process you followed. The worst that you could do is not think about it, or not go to any trouble, not take any effort to try to document your thought process. Unfortunately, the regulation is prescriptive, and it also drives a lot of requests for documenting. But you know, it could be a curse and a blessing, because by showing that you've been deliberate in certain processes and you've thought about it and you have assessed the risk, You may be mistaken at the end. Your judgment at the end may be not correct, but you're not going to be, in my opinion, you're not going to be as vulnerable to regulators as you were if you wouldn't think about it. Just go ahead and just be cavalier.
I know also in development teams, over the past few years, the concept of inline documentation has also become more important. And so if you can take your data into the development process and automate some of the documentation into the background, and it becomes part of the development process in and of itself, you can relate the decisions back to the purpose and why. And so it just becomes part of the system, and you gain efficiency, kind of like the data inventory processing systems have become part of how we do business. For instance, if you look at data inventories and data warehousing, you probably pull from one source of data, not two. And so you get better documentation, it helps your technical people, and it also then is transparent, I believe, for when a regulator says what and why. And so, another question.
There we go. I wonder for the technologists if you've looked at blockchain technology, and if there are any lights going off there in the privacy realm, because it seems you have distributed brokers and so on, and the possibility of creating a trust mechanism with a policy that follows data and so on.
Is this on? Yeah, good. Yeah, actually, that's one of the areas that, at least at my company, we're actively looking at. Not the blockchains that most people are familiar with, namely the Bitcoin kinds of things. They're not scalable for the kinds of purposes we're talking about. But what I would call assertion blockchains. So an assertion blockchain allows you to take a data set, or a data record rather, and apply a label to it, like I was saying before. But you could actually immutably apply that label by entering that into a blockchain. And
Associated with a policy or
and
enforcement mechanism.
right, and then you can associate any kind of association can be made into an assertion, which itself could be put into a blockchain. So the problem that we have right now is that the kinds of applications we'd like to apply that to typically require much more scale than any of the blockchain implementations that are available today. So we have a lot of work to do before we can actually do it. But I personally think with blockchain technology, it'll be very, very useful.
And then another question? Okay, so I think in terms of blockchain and so forth, another question goes, as we collect more information, then we document and track more information, do you think we'll end up having to then start looking at trade-off informations, because you collect a lot, you document it, but is there a point to where intrusion has to be looked at? Or the other part of anonymizing would be, how do you trust your data if it's so anonymized that you can't trust it because you can't track it back? So there are issues on the other side that can come out from the use of these technologies and the changes that we're envisioning.
Oh yeah, I mean the whole idea of anonymization. I mean, one of to sort of relate it back to the blockchain question is how can we trust, for example, a photograph that has been distributed through anonymous channels? So you don't know what the provenance of the digital photograph is. That is going to become an increasingly difficult problem, actually with video as well. In fact, some of the video processing technologies that I've seen recently that seem to show a record of reality, but in fact couldn't possibly be a record, at least in these demonstrations. That was the point of the demonstration. But think of it in a political context where you have people put into places where they obviously weren't, or perhaps hope that it would be obvious that they weren't. So the anonymizing things like the chain of handling for some purposes, because you want whistleblowers to be able to be protected on the one hand, but on the other hand, demonstrating data provenance that's going to be quite a hard problem. And that's another area where I think we can use things like blockchains to say, this happened at this moment, it's recorded in the blockchain.
I could probably be heard. You guys, okay. Hello, thank you. So this is a different, I can make a comment. There was a really interesting question earlier, how do you talk to the C-suite or to executives about embedding privacy and spending what it takes to do the right thing? And I think that trust can be monetized. Right now we monetize data, but we don't think of monetizing trust. Now, in regulated industries where you're vetted all the time by your business partners, by regulators, you already have monetized trust. You just don't measure it very carefully. It's often called compliance and so on. But you have to have certificates of compliance and audit reports and things like this, and you get asked questions. Do you have a policy on this? Do you follow the policy on that? Can we send our auditor in? So on. Guess what? Trust is already monetized. It's just we're not measuring it. And trust first under the GDPR to the data subject, but also commercial trust or other forms of partner trust is one way I think that we can talk to the C-suite.
That's a very good point. And I think they're also, one of the dangers is also that maybe at a certain level they're more used to look at risk. It's a language they understand better. We tend to be more familiar with loss of trust than with trust. And I think the point you're making, there's a lot of, even when people think about data breaches, you're measuring the cost of data breach. So you're always monetizing and giving a value and putting a price tag on the loss of trust, but nobody's really putting it on trust. Yeah, that's absolutely.
Yeah, so thinking about contracts now, as we have PBD coming online, are we going to need to be adjusting any of our contracts, or do our current contracts in relationships with vendors, is the language okay? Do you have any thoughts, or have you started working on that topic?
The European regulators have a lot of thoughts, actually, because again, it is a very prescriptive piece of regulation, so it mandates a number of requirements that data controllers have to adopt when contracting with data processor. So there is going to be a lot of privacy requirements coming to companies, and not necessarily from regulators, but from their customers being forced to request guarantee. I mean, the regulation uses the term guarantee compliance. So when you're purchasing from a supplier and from a vendor, the regulators expect you to ask that vendor for guarantee that they're not going to jeopardize your GDPR compliance. So it's a big deal. Yeah. Which will have a huge impact, and that's what I meant also when I said that there is an argument to be made that privacy by design would help to address that and reducing the friction. Because at the end of the day, if you are ready for the question, and if you're ready for that provision in the contract, your deal is going to go through much faster.
So, just do a time check quickly, and so. We have a couple minutes left. Is there anyone who has a last question? Yeah, okay.
Back to monetizing trust. Ships already sailed on this one, but it's the inverse of what we have now, as though the individuals were the custodians of our personal data that we release or lease out and could be monetized. But I think it's the cat's out of the bag, and we've let so much information out on ourselves, but clearly that could be turned over. In an ideal world. Just one other perspective, if we pull back from privacy by design, if we pull out a level, we could look at privacy engineering. And I just wanted to alert the room that I know privacy by design under GDPR text is very fuzzy and theoretical. However, privacy engineering, though not a regulation, is being explored. I just wanted to let the group know, in case you're not sure where to look for that, there's really two wonderful places to look. The Americans are doing a lot of work with privacy engineering with NIST, and in the European Union, it's being done by the European Data Protection Supervisor with a program called IPEN, I-P-E-N, and that's actually something I helped to found when I was with the EDPS. So the third place, and maybe fourth place where you can look would be the Article 29 Working Party, which gives a lot of good advice, and that will be rebranded as EDPB, of course. So keep your eyes peeled there for more granularity on privacy by design.
And I have one question for you, by the way, with your background. So how can an organization look at the resources that they have and start identifying who would be the right type of person to start taking on some of the role of privacy engineering? Because that could go in a couple of different ways, like a business expert or a business person who really knows systems well, but you could also take one of your technical staff. Do you have any thoughts on that, given your experience? How do you start doing privacy engineering if you want to get started?
Right. So the reason we started the IPEN project was because we have law and lawyers thinking about privacy, but the tech people think, what does anonymization really mean? I'll look at this database, how do I da-da-da-da? And so you have to put those two very different mind frames and perspectives together to actually enable and enact privacy in the real world. So I think that privacy engineering is best enabled via the tech arm, the ICT mind, informed by and questioned from the lawyer or the compliance mind. So it really takes both, but I think it's more on the engineering side, but perhaps you all would know. And then lastly, a shameful advert is that after 10 years in Brussels, I'm thinking of relocating to California, so I'm feeling out the job market in case you know of any opportunities.
Thank you
Sorry
so
for
much.
that.
And if I could say just one thing, right now we're at time. We have the room longer, but it is 1:30, and we know that some people may have to get back to work, so we're at time. But at the same time, there are a couple of us who are available and are happy to continue answering questions for a little bit. So I just wanted to say that. And so I've seen a couple of other hands and so forth. Yeah.
What NIST document or resource?
There's actually there's a privacy engineering working group via NIST. So just go to the NIST.
Ones that are embedding privacy in 853.
Wait, let me think of their name.
I think it's Naoma. It's Naoma Lefkowitz. I think is the head of that group.
Yes,
She used to run it.
She is, exactly.
So so they have regular workshops, reports, and so on. So that's something to look at. It was relatively high level, but they have good people working there. I just want to mention one more thing, because you mentioned privacy engineering. There's a wonderful workshop, an IEEE workshop on privacy engineering that you can look up. They have all the presentations and so on online. So that's also a wonderful resource to learn more. OWASP, yes.
OWASP as well.
Yes.
OWASP.
It's an web application security group.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's an organization actually that for kind of this middle area, but it's on the more technical side. There's an organization called OWASP, and they do application security. They have a lot of great tools and learning resources, and much of the writing is very reader friendly, slightly more technically inclined, but still very well documented. So it is a good resource if you're trying to just understand the high level technical perspective. Carnegie Mellon also has done a lot of research in privacy by design, MIT, so there are also some other organizations out there as well that have some great information, as well as IEPP on its website has started making inroads as well. I think we may have had another question. Would you like to ask a question? And let's get the microphone to you, please. Thank you.
This is real quick, and it's to Paola. You mentioned earlier that you have some questionnaires or a checklist that you use. Mm-hmm. Can you share that with the group, or can you share that with us?
Yeah, I don't have a problem. I can share. It's a list of questions that touches on some key product decisions, such as where is the data going to be located? Are we pseudonymizing it? How long are we retaining it? Who will have access? It's going to be really high level when you look at it, but surprisingly enough, if you put it all in one place, then people become familiar with it, and it's not always as intuitive. Yeah, I can send it out.
And so maybe to address that point is occasionally IAPP from the knowledge nets, we send out presentations and so forth, so we have your name and email address, and what we'll do is pull something together. It'll probably be next week, but we will send out the checklist, and maybe what we can try and do is also put a couple of bullet points in some of the resources mentioned, because everybody's going to have a different experience of what privacy by design means in your company. And so, are there any other questions that we have? And is there anything maybe that we didn't say but would like to say in closing thoughts today, do you think?
I don't have any closing thoughts.
Okay. I think what I've heard is there's checklists, there's currently what we've been doing with data inventories, but there also are newer technologies that you can build in. It's about also realizing working with your customers, I think, and really making product management and things like product marketing and or features lists, going to those places and really integrating and building, becoming a customer advocate. In support, it might be doing workflows, like I think we had Tomas talking about the HP Privacy Advisory tool that HP uses inside, so that employees are enabled to look stuff up as they're having to make decisions. So it's tools for support. So it'll be different things throughout the organization. So we thank you today for coming. We really appreciate your time for listening, and we will send a follow-up email. And finally, we're here for a few minutes if you have other questions as well. Thank you so much.